It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote address speaker today. It's Mayur Gupta, and he is the Chief Marketing and Chief Strategy Officer for Gannett. Welcome, Mayur.
Thank you so much, Nikki. So glad to be here. Such a wonderful panel, and I'm kind of bummed that I missed those very interesting and I'm sure very insightful sessions yesterday. I was really inspired by, I forgot what all analogies Matt shared, God, kings, and queens. So I'm going to figure out in the recording. I will check out what that was. But that was pretty inspirational. So I'm going to test my clicker to make sure it's working. Let me see. There you go. Now it did. Okay. So brand purpose and growth. And many of you may wonder what's so special about it, because for all practical purposes, brand purpose and growth is intertwined. And you build brands in response to your purpose. And once you are living that brand, growth organically happens. Unfortunately, the ground reality for at least many of us is not the same. I think in a growth at all costs world that we have been living in, at least for the last 15 years, brand and purpose, or purpose and profitability, brand and growth, brand and performance, they've kind of been on the opposite indices, and we've had to make those choices every single day. And that's one of the biggest challenges for our category and our industry as we evolve the core business model. So we'll talk a lot about that today. But before I go there, I usually like to spend just a minute on my journey and my background. I grew up in India, and like an average middle-class kid, I had no idea what I was doing in life. And back then, if you needed a job, you did computer science. I majored in computer science. I was an engineer, hence started my career at Sapien, which is a fantastic alma mater for me, and learned pretty much everything there, and spent almost 12 years before I moved to Kimberly-Clark, led digital and e-commerce there, was the first chief marketing technologist, then into healthcare, and then was fortunate enough to work in a wonderful growth, like one of the iconic brands of at least the last 20 years, Spotify, and then was a CMO at Freshly, and now at this wonderful place with an incredible mission to build communities where people and local businesses thrive, Gannett, the US Affiliate Network. The reason I like to share this is if you have better things to do than listening to an engineer telling you how best to market, this is your last chance, because that is what's about to happen. But like I shared, as I came to this industry, at least from organizations that were extremely customer obsessed, one of my biggest realizations was there's a fundamental shift that we are going through as a category, which is, besides all the things on subscriptions, et cetera, and the business models, but the fundamental shift is that we are evolving from a category that is obsessed with, or historically obsessed with, audience attention, where the business model considers audience and eyeballs to be the core product, and that's the supply side. And on demand side, you have advertisers pretty much pay for it. That has been a century-old media business. And I think I won't be wrong if I said that we are all now evolving rather quickly that business model where we truly put the customer at the center, and we're shifting the obsession from user traffic to user value, where we are shifting the obsession from eyeballs to customer and what it means for them, and the core product evolves from audience attention to core content, and we are shifting from making only brands and advertisers pay to now elevating that customer experience every single day so that we can inspire the customers to pay for it. And that, while it sounds very simple, on paper, I'm sure we all can vouch, is a very hard and steep mountain to climb. But that is the world we live in. And I'm sure with all the brands and products we consume every single day, that's the kind of experience we drive. And once you do that, the magical part is once you're able to build that hook, once you're able to live that customer obsession every single day, like a day one organization, there's so many concentric circles and incremental value adds that you can build that maximize the lifetime value, that maximizes the lifetime revenue. But underneath all of this is a firm realization that subscription is not just a business model. It is not just a different way to sell your core product. It's a mindset. It's a cultural shift. It is the DNA, that mindset of being customer obsessed, the mindset of trying to figure out how do I add incremental value, not just to the customer who's at risk, but even your most loyal customer, because you know that the only way you prevent the user from leaving your ecosystem is when you raise that emotional bar higher and higher every single time. And there are incredible brands that have done that extremely successfully, like Amazon, and we all have read and heard a lot about how they came about the idea of Amazon Prime. But that is the bar that is being set, which means that for many of our legacy brands that have done an incredible job over the last century, we are almost back to the drawing board to reprove and recreate the product market fit. Much like a startup, we are all in that 0 to 1 state, or at least some of us. I shouldn't speak for everybody. At the very least, Gannett is, and our ecosystem of flagship and incredible local and nationwide brands, we are challenging ourselves to now operate like a startup, to evolve from an incumbent to a disruptor, where we believe that the only moat we have now is going to be our ability to move faster than anybody else. And I feel that a lot of that rhythm to move fast and create a lot of the disruption and build growth started back in 2007, 2008, where Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook were struggling to break the 50 million monthly active user mark. And then they brought on this growth team, which was led by Chamath Palihapitiya. And they created, in many ways, this euphoria around growth at all costs. And while it was great and has done some wonderful things for Facebook and many other growth companies, originating from Silicon Valley and otherwise, interestingly enough, it has also created a challenge where over the last 10 to 15 years, in that inertia of growth at all costs, many brands or many growth companies lost the focus on its soul, lost the focus on the brand itself, and where the soul kind of disappeared, and everything became all about the CAC, all about the discount, all about the pace at which I can bring more users in. And that has taught some very basic and core lessons that we are applying now at Gannett to make sure that purpose for us is not just a facade, that growth for us will not come in isolation from our purpose or the brand, where we actually are challenging ourselves to think about how purpose will drive profitability for us, how strong, resilient brands will ultimately drive higher growth, more efficient acquisition, higher retention rates, and higher LTV through our efforts across the board. And some of the lessons, like I said, that we've learned is first and foremost, as part of that customer obsession, is that belief system that the only moat we will have as an organization is now our ability to move faster than the competition. It's the rate of iteration. It is going to be based on our mindset of being fearless and our ability to experiment, test, and learn, and focus on outcomes and not outputs. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then secondly, we're also very conscious that when you move at that pace, when you build that agility where you are pivoting multiple times, where you're testing and learning and experimenting, inevitably you end up creating chaos. But what is very important to become a disruptor is where you create a culture that is strong enough where people thrive in that chaos, where your intent is not to calm the chaos down. Of course, it's a conscious chaos, so it's not uncontrollable chaos, but which also means that you have to invest equally in evolving and building that culture through more transparency, more communication, and more conversation, but also creating a safe environment where you celebrate failures just as much as you celebrate successes. And needless to say that yes, we all can have those incredible strategies about our North Stars, about what we want to do, but until we have that foundation of that strong culture that cultivates that mindset and behavior, it is going to eat your strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. To the point where you no longer feel that purpose and growth is a choice. As a matter of fact, if you sit in marketing or if you sit in product, you all believe that your core purpose is to drive growth. As a matter of fact, you get it to the point where your purpose is to apply that mission, is to apply that vision of who you are and why you exist as a catalyst to grow your business. Where, as for example, for marketing, its mission is now to apply that purpose to grow the business, to connect with the user base, to use the purpose as a guiding force to influence your product roadmap and influence your tone of voice and everything else you create as an organization. And what I mean by growth, and the purpose to grow, it is not just the lower funnel or quantitative measure of how many subscribers you have, but it is a concentric, flywheels of growing the brand, growing the user base, growing the user value, or in other words, these three always on flywheels of creating new demand, capturing that demand, and retaining that demand. Now, it's not either or. It is not that, why don't I just focus on lower funnel acquisition and retention, and I'm going to build the brand once I've reached a certain pinnacle? Because the moment you do that, you're only backing yourself on the power of functional and utilitarian value. You are not building that emotional value, which prevents you from creating new demand and expanding your total addressable market. And that is why the investment in that core brand is just as quintessential as your ability to acquire and retain your audience. And a fundamental shift in order for many organizations, especially marketing and growth functions, because marketing is one function within the C-suite that has disrupted and evolved more than any other function in the last 13 to 14 or 15 years with the influx and intertwining of data and technology. The biggest shift we all have to make as marketers is a mindset shift from thinking about outputs to outcomes. There is so much euphoria and excitement about campaigns and the things we do, and very little about the impact it creates both on the customer and their life and their behavior, as well as on the business and the business outcome. And that is a fundamental shift that we all have to make in how we think about the purpose and the operating model of marketing and growth in any organization. And I'm sure if many of you who are working on very aggressive goals, and either in a startup or a direct-to-consumer business, it's an unfortunate situation where brand in today's world, in a world of growth at all costs, has almost become a stigma, where if you're spending $5 or the $100, one of the big questions you get asked is, what is the ROI on that investment? And what is the return? Almost to the point where being on the brand team is almost a fearful environment because it is hard to measure and it is hard to prove the addressability of that effort. But that's where I feel as marketers, we have to get creative and we have to converge and get innovative with how do we measure the impact of that investment in building that emotional brand, in building that resilient brand? How do we identify more proxy and indirect KPIs that do not have to wait for 6 to 9 months to figure out the lift in your brand awareness or consideration? The challenge for us is how do we connect brand to business? How do we connect purpose profitability and measure that with more short-term KPIs, whether they are direct or indirect, which I like to call proxy KPIs. So I'm going to shift gears now with all that theory, which I'm sure on paper makes a lot of sense. But how do you enable that in your daily life? When we are all scrambling for those numbers at the end of each week, each month, and each quarter. So there are 5 core principles that I would love to share that I challenge myself to apply with varying degrees of success or failure. One of them, or the first one, is a shift, a fundamental shift from perfection to experimentation. And what I mean by that, there's no such thing as perfection anymore in business, let alone in marketing, which means that everything you do has to be based on test and learn and the agility and the velocity of that, of your experimentation cycles. Instead of waiting for 3 months to come up with the best creative idea and the best creative campaign and the best creative assets, whichever part of the funnel, you rather create 4 variations and 5 variations, come up with a test plan and test and learn, and let the customer and the data tell you what works and what doesn't work. The key is not only the ability to have those creative assets in the test plan, but do you have the velocity? Do you have the supply chain to test and learn in a cross-functional way that breaks on the traditional silos of creative, data, science, performance, media, and so on? So the key magic happens at the intersection of all those isolated functions. The second principle is that you have to, or we all have to, move away from measuring the impact of the outputs to measuring success against outcomes. What I mean by that is, one example that I like to share always is, instead of celebrating the launch of a campaign, which happens very often, how many of us are actually celebrating the impact that that campaign had to create? And that is the mindset. How many of us measure the success of how many people came to our platform? Of course, as a media company, that makes sense, because that perhaps the number of visitors is your North Star KPI, but no longer. As a subscription-led economy, the number of visitors is only a leading indicator. What matters is how much time are they really spending? Our understanding of a certain type of behavior that they're performing on the platform, which ultimately leads them down through the journey to one day eventually subscribe and pay. So there is that gap between the output KPIs and the absolute North Star KPI in terms of the number of subscribers. The magic happens right in the middle, because those are the levers that your growth teams have to optimize every single day. The second challenge that most of us face, especially in the function of marketing, is when you end up spending 80% of your dollar in the unmeasurable part of marketing, which is more top of funnel, which is hard to measure and quantify, and only 20% that moves the needle. And the magic there is that you shift that distribution, where you start to invest 80% of your dollar to get to 100% of your goal. Because the moment you did that, now you have the $20 that you can truly spend in what is absolutely irrational, serendipitous, and that is what builds the emotional connection. But if you flip it, that is when the monkey gets on your back and people start to ask the question, what is your true ROI on all this spend? And then third is, in order for all of us to be able to operate towards those outcomes, it is very important to organize ourselves around outcomes and not outputs. And whether we like it or not, the experiences that we deliver are a direct reflection of how we are organized and how we operate. So if our existing operating model and our organizational structure is siloed, where we are all focused on respective OKRs and KPIs and respective different individual outcomes, we are inevitably going to create and deliver broken and fragmented experiences that will not move the user behavior. And at Gannett, at least within the marketing organization, we think about ourselves as a combination of capability builders, who are the horizontals, who are building world-class capabilities and learning every single day. How do we build new muscle? But then the flywheels are basically the functions that are responsible for those outcomes, for those KPIs. So growing the brand, the user value, creating new demand, capturing new demand. But then we've also come up with a model of building cross-functional pods, where you bring product managers, you bring data scientists, you bring engineers, marketeers, and content editors in one single pod, and now they share the same outcome, they share the same OKRs, and that delivers magic, because at the end, the customer experiences and the customers themselves, they sit at that intersection. They're not operating in the isolated worlds of technology, data science, or storytelling. And very importantly, for marketing and growth, it is important to drive visibility and transparency and be very clear about what will be those measurable outcomes. So we have now institutionalized objectives and key results across the organization to align ourselves cross-functionally on where we are headed, what success looks like month over month, quarter over quarter. And we are using that as a yardstick, not only to create cross-functional collaboration, but also making sure we are making the right choices in terms of our prioritization across the board. Because there's so many things that we can do, but it does not mean that those are the things that we absolutely should do at that moment. So this is an example of the Gannett rhythm that we've created, driven by our global strategy and ops team, where we have a combination of committees and pods. At the end, all of the work that's happening on the ground with thousands of employees who work for Gannett, now laddering up to our North Star goals and North Star KPIs. Fourth, very importantly, with an ever-evolving ecosystem that we are all sitting on top of, especially in the world of growth and marketing and content distribution, where there is a massive proliferation of channels and touch points through which the consumers engage offline and online, it is very important to build an engine where all the parts are stitched and connected. And what I mean by that is, yes, we are all going after data. And yes, some of you and some of us are probably challenging ourselves to create a supply chain of data to create insights, if you're lucky. But then some of us are now struggling to figure out, okay, I do have the insights, but I don't have the remaining supply chain to take action of that insight. So I know I'm about to lose this user. I know this user is waiting for this content, but those piping is missing to be able to communicate that user and send that user that piece of content just in time before they give up and lose and go somewhere else. Because the barrier to enter another ecosystem or the barrier to actually earn loyalty is much, much higher, which means that it's very important that we are absolutely focused on the underlying engine and the ecosystem where the pipes aren't broken, where if you have data, you have an ability to translate that into insight. If you have insight, you have an ability to take action and test and learn, but reach that consumer the moment you want to engage, because there is not much time between the customer making a choice from brand A to brand B. And that's a very high bar. And I'm sure we're all battling and struggling with that notion. And whether we like it or not, this is much of what many of our ecosystems feel like. There are many organizations that don't even have all the parts yet. They are still building all the parts. And there are many who somehow have managed to build all the parts or the machinery, but they haven't yet stitched it all together. And then in that process of stitching and running fast, sometimes everyone has a different end state. So it is very much possible that you have the tire of a Jeep, but the chassis of a truck, and you're trying to stitch it all together. That is why it's very important to bring the mindset of systems thinking. You want to have a culture that is able to do top down and bottom up. You want to know where you are going 5 years from now, but you want to be able to plan week over week, day over day, and month over month. And that's a fun part of systems thinking and design thinking principles, where while you have a North Star, you have a vision, but you have the speed and the agility to pivot every single week, if you had to. And fifth one, I promise, is the last principle and lesson, is it's often easy to talk about data. And as more and more businesses become more direct to consumer and have plethora of first party data, it is very easy to get overshadowed and overwhelmed by the first party data. But here's a big difference. The first party data tells us what the users are doing and perhaps where they are doing it. What it does not give us is why. And that is where we have to think about data more holistically. We have to invest and build that user obsession that will dive into the why, that will apply the qual and the quant, that will value that secondary and the primary research just as much as the value of the first party data, because the magic happens at that intersection when you apply all kinds of insights to not only understand what the users are doing, but even more importantly, understand the causality and not just correlation of why they're doing it, because that gives you the best chance to change that human behavior, to prevent that outcome, and to lead the users to the desired outcome. And I'll actually lie, I have one more principle, which I didn't number because I wanted to, 5 sounds more cool, is lastly, move away from the mindset of campaigns. The customer do not have a start and end date. That mom who's looking for the next pack of diapers is not waiting for the Christmas campaign to get 20% off. She's doing it at 10:40 at night, when the kids have gone to sleep. She's finally relaxing on an iPad or a phone. And if you're not there in that moment, if you're not always on, you're going to lose her. And that is the opportunity that we have. It's very hard because we're all used to what we used to call the product value of death, which is if your traffic is slowing down, if your growth is slowing down, what do? You launch another feature. What is the outcome by the end of this process? Is an unusable app. What do you do when you're a marketer and when you run behind numbers? You launch a campaign. And what happens by the end of it? There is so much confusion and you become a campaign obsessed organization versus creating a flywheel where you're constantly listening, where you're constantly testing and you're constantly engaging and building an always on engine that is building community, that is having conversation with the user as opposed to a one directional throwing of ads and offers to the user. That's a hard journey to be on, but that is the bar that the customer is setting today, and we don't really have an option. And lastly, no matter what we do, with all the euphoria around data that we all have access to, please let's make sure that we don't let data destroy our soul, because at the end, the brands that are going to survive are the ones that are going to create that culture and emotional connection with their audiences. Thank you.
I definitely believe this is going to be one of those presentations that people are going to want to refer back to because it's super helpful to think the way that you guys are thinking. So one of the things that I was fascinated about, and I kind of took a note of when you first started talking, was the evolution and how you guys are genuinely transitioning your mindset. And what I mean by that is that, I think this is kind of a funny thing to think about, but there was this question that people used to ask, which said, what are the industries that refer to their customers as users? Really only web digital companies and drug dealers. And so when we think about companies and, us thinking of audiences as eyeballs and just someone to chase versus giving them something of value, it's a very different way of thinking. And so I'd like your perspective on how easy of a sell that's been internally in the culture to make that shift.
So that's a great question. I don't think I've heard that before, the drug dealership part, but it's a great question, Nikki, because I absolutely agree that it's a very hard jump. Fortunately, at Gannett, we had been at that inflection point for so many years that personally, I was very grateful that by the time I came on the board and then I finally took on an operating role last year, we were almost emotionally and mentally there to make that leap. Now, the question was only how well we are able to execute, which is the journey that we are on with speed and agility. But mentally, we were there where we wanted to bring that mindset shift because we all realized and have strongly believed that the future of any business is going to be determined and influenced by the amount of user value that we provide and how every single person, regardless of the role they play, when they come back in the morning, are we thinking about data that tells us how do I add that one more level of incremental value? Where we are not waiting for the user to tell us in a survey response that I wanted a faster horse, or I wanted Amazon Prime, but how are we leveraging data to preempt and predict your needs even before you know you need it? Now, where we are, we have that intent. We absolutely want to be there, but we know that we are very early on in that 100-yard touchdown, right? So we've evolved from being very transparent here, from being unconsciously incompetent to become consciously incompetent. But we are on our way to become consciously competent and hopefully someday unconsciously competent. And that'll be euphoria.
I love that analogy. Okay, so one of the questions that's come in, I don't know if we need to go back to this slide or if it's just kind of difficult to toggle back, but you'll probably know which one she's referencing. Liz Kennedy asked, can you unpack the engine slide a bit more? Because I think this is something that piqued people's interest. We'd love for you to take us through that.
Yeah, see, this is an outcome of an engineer pretending to be a marketeer. You only see arrows and circles and boxes because those are the only dimensions I was trained on. So I love that question. What I mean by this is, if you are marketing or growth or even product, one thing that stays always on 365 days a year is the flywheel. And let's unpack it if you want to be tactical so that we can take one thing back, is your journey, your process to ingest data and understand the why for your core cohorts and segments. That is not a 3-month process that happens once a year in Q2 or Q3. That should be happening every single day with your data team. They should be constantly looking at, every day, every week, the user behavior. And I'm assuming you all have some kinds of dashboards or Excel sheets where you're looking at cohort penetration, cohort distribution, user behavior, you're using product analytics platform. That's the always on engine. So that's the ingestion part. How are we understanding every single day something more about our core user base and something more about the users who are not on the platform yet, but they represent your growth segments and your growth audience. The second part of that always on engine is the communication and the conversation you want to have with your users, which also there's no single way to talk to a diverse set of audiences who may be in diverse stages of the journey. So how do you test and learn? What is your supply chain of creating new creative assets, storytelling, different tone of voices based on who the user is, and different channels and touch points, because every channel and touch points has its own nuance on what works. And what works on Facebook is very different from a creative asset that will actually work on an email and drive a click through versus what may work on platform and the users come. Now, that's the always on engine. But then these spikes that you see, those are the cultural moments, or those are your key business moments. Those are your key, content moments. You don't want to overshadow them, right? You don't want to overlook them. The key is, how do you connect the two pieces? So when you do have that big cultural moment, how does that flow in and flow out into your always on engine? And that magic, that cross-pollination of campaigns every now and then, but very importantly, building that underlying always on engine, that I feel is a sustainable growth model. It is not an either or. You can't go back to the world where you do 6 campaigns and you spend millions of dollars and you just pray and pray, and you come back to see 6 months later what really happened.
Yeah, makes sense. So when you talked about outputs versus outcomes, one of the things that I think was really helpful is when you used the example of an outcome being brand. Can you share with us just anecdotally what a really good example of an output is, just so we can kind of see the difference between those and how you're defining them?
Sure. And there are many outputs. The number of campaigns you've launched, how many people saw your ad, how many people came to your site, aka visitors, how many people saw an email and clicked on it. Brilliant. But what is the outcome? Yes, they clicked on it, but they dropped off. And who clicked on it? And yes, I had this great creative ad that actually had this much click through and very low CPL, very low CPM on Facebook. How does that matter? It's 0.1% conversion rate. I have these many followers on Instagram. Are they really talking to you? Is there really a community? So there's so many of these, or if you're a product, we launch X many features. We have these many app downloads. Yes, do you have these many app downloads, but how, what is the MAU to DAU ratio? How engaged are those users? Do they have a consistent pattern? Is your time spent on platform going up? So that's the difference between outcomes and these are the vanity KPIs. And across many industries, we've been influenced by the vanity KPIs, especially marketing. And we have to challenge ourselves to focus on optimizing the outcome KPIs because they are more close to the business. They're more close to the core customer behavior.
Right. No, I think those are great examples. I appreciate you sharing those. And you yourself brought up Facebook. So this is where we're going to go next in our question. Facebook, Google, everyone feels like they drive a tremendous amount of traffic, but sitting in your role, obviously, at Gannett with more than 100 sites that you guys are overseeing, what really are some other platforms, if there are any, that you feel that are driving traffic significantly for you guys?
See, I come from a growth kind and engineering background. So I've worked on a few direct-to-consumer startups where you have to focus so much on driving organic traffic to your ecosystem. That is gold. Like that is the most precious stone, solitaires or whatever it is, right? And in those direct-to-consumer businesses, fortunately or unfortunately, the Googles and the Facebooks who do command platforms that do command billions of user base do command a big portion of the focus area. At Gannett, I think we have so much gold underneath where the impetus of our organic funnel is so strong because of our content. We bring 150 million users every single month organically on our platform to consume that great content, and 50 million in UK, so close to 200 million across the USA Today network. So we don't as much think about any more channels to bring people. What we think about is how do I add incremental value when they do come in my backyard? So the fortune and that we do have is there are all these people, pretty much every single person in our TAM, one way or the other, comes to our backyard. What we are doing now is how do I don't just let you go? How do I build a relationship? And how do I tell you more about us? Because I don't think I've done a good job explaining who I really am. What I do have is a magnet, which is our core content. Hence the shift from the core product is no longer the people who are coming. The core product is content. And we want to use the content to hook the person. So once you've come in, I want to figure out ways on how do I take you to yet another content and build habits. And that's the focus that we have, and less about what more doors can I open for you, because I'm pretty much touching everybody.
Right. Yeah, no, that's super helpful to think of it that way. Just one more thing that I want to think about that you could perhaps add some context to. I truly feel like when people listen to you and they see your slides, you're at, for a lot of people, an aspirational state, a state that they'd like to get to. And one of the things that you mentioned at the very beginning of your presentation that really stuck with me is that It's obviously a legacy industry and business, but you're trying to shift to be much more like a startup and to say, we have to be the disruptor. We have to prove to people that they want our product. And one of the things that you keyed in on was the rate of speed at which you could move. And that actually being potentially a differentiator for you. And so in all of the things that you measure, I'm most curious if you guys have a way to actually measure how you're doing at that. Can you keep note of or track your ability or the speed at which you're iterating?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, Nikki. You've given me a great idea. As one of our internal KPIs that I should institutionalize. But the way I would think about is usually, and again, this is a little bit of an output KPI, but I think it can be a good proxy, is the number of experiments you're doing across different functions. So think about the speed at which you're moving ahead. It can also be the number of products that you're launching that are moving the needle. It can be the iteration of code changes and releases that you're doing to optimize the customer experience. I would say that's how I would think. Of course, all of us, I'm sure, on this call here are hawking our data every single day. We now have scrums where the growth teams huddle 3 or 4 times a week, cross-functionally, product engineers, data scientists. But I love that question, and I would love to institutionalize that more with that, because if speed is your core moat to move forward, you have to be able to figure out on how you're progressing on that KPI. So maybe in the next year, if you do bring me back, I will have a more quantitative answer. But I would say definitely circling around the rate of experiments, which we have come a long way. We have an experimentation model and a team that solely focuses on designing tests and sharing results and driving through those tests. But I would love to look at a graph where we show how many tests are we doing in a given month.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks so much for sharing that. And we appreciate that. We'll be tracking progress. You're welcome here anytime. And we really appreciate you taking us through this. It looks like we need to wrap up for today, but you've given us a lot to think about. And we really appreciate you kicking us off today, Mayur.
Great. Thank you, Nikki and Matt, and thanks for having me over.